No, I don't want to record now. There you go. And I will put the recording in the resource section. I will put the recording in the resource section on the InTA platform. Okay, so let's start. Let's be very Swiss. Fred actually just told me we are 2 minutes late. It's not very Swiss, so we're getting right on it. Imagine a classroom where students just don't learn about science or history or geography, but where they learn through another language. A classroom where language and content grow together, where students think deeply, they express creatively, and they become confident multilingual learners. This is what CLIL makes possible. Whether you're new with CLIL or whether you've been doing CLIL for years in your classroom, today's discussion is about bringing more awareness to CLIL, about giving you some new perspectives, giving you some practical strategies and tools, and sharing with you real examples that you can hopefully bring to your classrooms right away. Good evening. Good evening and welcome to this CLIL panel discussion hosted by InTA, the Innovating Teachers Academy. My name is Dunja and I'm your moderator. I've been an educator my entire career. I am part of the GRATS group at the European Center of Modern Languages, and I'm the founder of InTA, a multilingual platform for teachers by teachers. I'm so pleased to have you tonight. Thank you for taking the time to join us. As the moderator, today, my role is first to guide the flow of our conversation and make sure we stay focused on the most relevant and practical aspects of CLIL. I'll also introduce each topic, inviting our experts to share their perspective. And I'll open the floor at the end of the session of the discussion so you can ask some questions. So please, during the discussion, if you have any questions, please jot them down so then you have them at the end. And most of all, I'm here to help create a space where thoughtful exchanges might happen. So throughout this discussion, we're going to explore questions about the principles and the pedagogy of CLIL. We're going to look at questions about CLIL in the language classroom. And we're going to look at questions about CLIL in the discipline classroom. But first, before we get in the discussion, I'd like to introduce you to our distinguished panelists, 3 exceptional educators and researchers who are shaping CLIL practices across Europe and beyond. So first, I would like to welcome Professor Coyle. She is a global leader in CLIL and co-creator of the Pluriliteracies approach. She teaches at the University of Edinburgh. Her work bridges language and subject learning in innovative ways. She is also part of the ECML GRATS group and recently co-authored a deeper learning companion to CLIL. In case this is it right here. Do, could you tell us something that nobody knows about you?
Well, we've got to be really careful when we're answering these kind of questions, but I will divulge one area that is so important to me personally that I don't mind who shares it, and that is that I'm in love with ballet. And so it's really important to me that I have probably 5 or 6 ballet lessons per week, because something like ballet, people assume it's just a practical prancing around. Actually, it's deeply cognitive, and what that means is that you cannot think about anything else. And I think as an educator, a researcher, and so on, it's a really fabulous place to be in terms of only thinking about the moment and how the physical, the social, and the cognitive all come together. So that's
Well, you're very lucky. It's always, I mean, if we can find an activity we can do to empty our mind, I mean, that's the best thing we can do as educators.
Okay, bring your point shoes out then.
Well, welcome. I'd like to welcome also Dr. Susanne Staschen-Dielmann. Susanne has taught politics, history, and English in Germany and the UK, and now leads a teacher seminar for the Berlin Senate. She's a CLIL researcher and trainer, co-author of A Deeper Learning Companion to CLIL, and a key contributor to Berlin's CLIL certificate. Susanne, if you could instantly become fluent in any language you don't already speak, which one would it be and why?
Well, that certainly would be Italian because I love Italy. I've got Italian friends who are lovely as well. And it's because Italian is so full of emotion, and it always seems that people are either quarreling or very much in love or very enthusiastic, and I love that. And yeah, I've also went to an Italian karaoke night, which was really fun, singing Adriano Celentano songs. But this is probably more fun if you don't know the language. That's what I think.
Well, there you go. And we can see how we can use music to learn a language. It's very motivating. And like Susanne said, maybe we don't even need to know the language to be able to follow and go sing in the karaoke. Well, thank you, Susanne. And I would like to welcome Frédéric Taveau. Frédéric teaches at the International School of Geneva, bringing over 32 years of experience in multilingual education. He has worked closely with both the ECML Graz group and Professor Coyle to develop CLIL units that put learners at the center, supporting both content mastery and language development. Fred, if you had not gone into education, what do you think you'd be doing today?
They're a cake maker, but that's not so good for my waistline. So, no, I would have been a gardener. I used to watch religiously gardeners' programs on the BBC. And if I'd not gone into the field of helping children grow, then I would have helped plants and flowers grow, although I do that in my own garden. So it's all to do with growth.
Oh,
And like though I forget absolutely everything when I'm in the garden and pottering around. So it's a nice hobby to have.
yes, it is. It's a very relaxing one and a healthy one. And being in the garden really takes you away from all the rush of daily life. Exactly. Well, thank you very much for being here and sharing with us your knowledge about CLIL. Now, let's dive into the heart of the discussion. We're going to have actually three types of discussion, and we're first going to start with the pedagogy and the principles of CLIL with Coyle. So I'll start with the first question. What kind of guidance is there to help teachers design units of work within a CLIL framework?
Okay, thank you, Dunja. So the first question is one which is incredibly difficult to answer because there isn't an answer, because the guidance comes after some kind of understanding of what CLIL is in particular contexts. So I've been involved in CLIL now for decades, and I've watched how it's evolved. And so I think before you can go straight to the guidance, and people, and I understand this, teachers often want toolkits, guidance, and so on. However, all the guidance in the world won't make a difference unless we take a step back and we take it a little bit more slowly. And for me, it's first of all deciding what content and language integrated learning means in a particular context, because CLIL is not a mantra. It's evolved over many decades into a whole range of context-sensitive approaches to teaching and learning in bilingual settings. So we know that in secondary school, it could possibly be geography, history through the medium of another language. It could be language per se, foreign languages, additional languages, how that contributes to CLIL, and it certainly does, especially because I believe that languages are a discipline in their own right. And at primary level, it can be generalist. So it can mean all of these different things. And I honestly believe, through having worked with, all my research has been with teachers. And over the years, what is so important is to start not with the guidance, but with a deep understanding of what CLIL will be. And that doesn't mean that it's, oh, you can do anything. If you just call it CLIL and you're doing a little bit of language, doing a little bit of content, fine. It's not that. There are some really key principles. And do we actually take what it means? It just, in some ways, it simply means that as well as learning a subject, you are also learning the medium through which that subject is being taught. And as I say, for me, languages themselves are a subject discipline in their own right. That is the key underpinning principle. And so we have to, for me, it's around language as a learning tool, not only a communication tool. We're always talking about communication and how you've got to be able to say certain things. But to me, if learners understand that it is a learning tool, then it means that we can have conversations about learning in lessons. So for starters, then, I do think that wherever we are, and I know that some of you may well be experts in CLIL, some may well not have done it, some may have thought about doing it. So I'm just throwing these ideas out, but I'm just sharing with you what I've come to the conclusion of after working over a long, long time with different teachers, different countries, different schools, and so on. So the key principle then is that we have to define how the CLIL in our context-specific area, what the demands are in our own field, in our own school, if that's the way we're doing it. And so I would just like to say that over the period of time, CLIL has gone through several eras. And the first one was binary, where everybody was, is it content, is it language, which is more important? That was the binary, that was the beginning. And of course, we know that you can't separate out content and language, because content is language. Language on its own is a semiotic tool. Language, words on their own are meaningless. Okay? Out of context, they're meaningless, they're little symbols. So that was the binary era. And then we went into integration. So everything then was, how do we integrate them? How do we integrate content and language together? And more recently, it's developed into a much more holistic era, what I would call holistic, because actually when we're teaching and learning, we all know as educators that you cannot separate out the learner, the teacher, the learners, the teacher, the relationships, and so on, what happens in classrooms, as well as what is being learned, what is being taught, and how it's being taught, the project areas. So the holistic sense, or the ecological sense, means that we don't separate out the language, the communication, the content, the cognition, the learning processes, and crucially, the cultures. And let's face it, many of us work in very, very diverse classrooms, multicultural classrooms, and so on. We can't separate all of those areas out. And instead, we have to look at building a conceptual model which brings all those together. Now, you might think that sounds very abstract. Yes, it is, because no one model, and I always quote Hugo Battens-Beardsmore, no one model for CLIL exists. And if people think it does, then actually it's not for export, because we have to create our own. And the first step is defining that context and the goals, the values, the timetables, the expertise of the teachers, and so on and so forth. Now, if we're looking at what kind of guidance is there, then if you're working in networks with teachers, or you are in a network already, then sharing those ideas is absolutely critical. And of course, if you go onto the internet, there are loads and loads of toolkits and websites. There's some classic websites, but watch out for some new ones. There's CLIL Lit Sit from ECML. There's CLIL Net LE. which is a cost-funded initiative combining lots and lots of countries. And there you will find some superb resources that are already there as exemplars. Once you have the exemplars, I'm not talking about that. I think Fred and Susanne are more. So if I come back then to probably probably one of the most used, I have to say, got evidence of this, one of the most used models is, and it's a conceptual model. So it doesn't tell you how to do it, it's a conceptual model. And I would say it's the 4 C's, which is content, communication, i.e. language, cognition and culture. And the reason for that was that when I was working with Spanish teachers many, many, many years ago, they felt that that was the most important reminder of all the things that they had to remember. And, you know, perhaps for me, the most fundamental areas that are find the 4 C's. There's also the triptych, and I think Fred is going to talk about that. And then more recently, there's the Pluriliteracies model, which is a genuine attempt now at being holistic in terms of taking into account not only the mechanics of the learning, that is the cognition and the language and so on, but also what teachers need to do to mentor the learning, not the learner. That's something different, to mentor learning and enable the pupils to develop. And that's the Pluriliteracies model of teaching learning. And there are 5 questions that are asked there. And the 5 guiding questions, if I can read off my screen, is what do I want my learners to do or to know? How will I know or they know they know? So what is the evidence for this? And how can I support active knowledge co-construction for my learners? How can I support learners every step of the way? And how can I promote growth mindsets for deeper learning? Now, you could argue that all of those are about any kind of educational setting. Correct, they are. And I think we have to situate that back into where we are. And to end up this little this section of it, I would say that even as far back as 2010, the CLIL book, which was called CLIL, Cambridge University Press, and Coyle Marsh, is in chapter 4, provides lesson plans, unit checklists, and so on. And they're all underpinned by theoretical ideas. So what I think if my final comment then is that actually before we go to design and before we go to guidance, we have to be clear on the nature of the guidance that will speak to us most. And there's a lot of toolkits and so on out there. But I think if we have an understanding of our own context and what our priorities are, then I think that will certainly help to look towards a more literacies, holistic approach for covers the widest possible range of learners and concepts. I don't know how helpful that is, but that is where I would position it. And I'm drawing on the messages that I've got from teachers.
Well, thank you so much for Do, for reminding us that yes, we can find many, many resources on the internet. There are many sites with lesson plans, with ideas, and so on. However, it is important to remember that we need to look at what are the demands in our schools, and we need to define our own context before we can start diving into it.
Mm-hmm.
And then once we have our goals, our structure, and a good understanding of where we're going, and especially where our students are going, what do we want them to be able to do, and to be able to do and learn, then we can start putting in all the different strategies and practices. Thank you. And I have a second question for you is, what does it mean for a teacher to be a designer of learning in a CLIL context?
Okay, so this question is very much related to the previous one. In the previous one, what I was trying to emphasize was the importance of having a conceptual model that is shared and agreed with teachers. And in particular now, I'm very inspired, I think, by a whole range of teachers with whom I'm working currently in the Basque Country, but also the whole notion of teachers as designers, because in some contexts, in many contexts, teachers find that they're given a textbook or they're given resources that they have to use. Now, from where I'm standing, a textbook writer is offering some resources that are used. However, the writers don't know your own learners, they don't know your context and so on. So for me, textbooks are fine, but they always need some kind of adaptation. And so this is where I believe that teachers, if teachers see themselves as designers of learning, if they also include their learners as being part of that design, then I think we start to develop vibrant classrooms, which are quite different from the idea that the teacher is all knowledge and so on. So in terms of design, to me, a design is not a lesson plan. And throughout our whole careers as teachers, we're always told to submit our lesson plans. What is a lesson plan? A lesson, in most places, lasts for the maximum of an hour, usually. And so to do all this micro planning for 1 hour without the unit planning, I think teachers have been asked to focus on the wrong thing. And so for me, it's around a series of lessons, which ultimately brings us to the concept of design, so that we know where we want our students to be. We know what we want them to do at the end of a whole series of lessons that involves actionable knowledge, not just passing a test or passing vocabulary or whatever. It is around them actually being able to use that in real life situations. So for me personally, I prefer a backward design kind of action where I know where I want my learners to be, and then I'll work backwards. However, this actually, the whole of CLIL requires us to design tasks and activities which are not usually in the repertoire of either subject teachers who are teaching in the dominant language or language teachers. So in other words, it is absolutely essential to focus in the design area on the types of tasks. And this is particularly essential in our contemporary AI digital world. And so for me, it's around looking at broad areas such as how do we develop different kinds of fluencies in our learners? And this is drawing a little bit on the literacies model. For me, we have to go beyond always wanting linguistic fluency, working towards linguistic fluency. And to me now, the design is very much along the role of text. And by text, I mean multimodal text. So it could be, it's not the comprehension test with the questions. It is more in terms of, could be audio, video. I was in a classroom this week where the learners were doing vid chats, where you have little sections of video and discuss them and so on. So in other words, I think it's the nature of the tasks. And for me, I'm always particularly inspired by a whole field which didn't really become involved with CLIL for quite some time. And that is the field of English as an additional language. Now, there's also German as an additional language and French as an additional language. If your CLIL language happens to be English, then EAL, activities, actions, tasks, they are like, they're just so inspirational. So what I would say here is that in order to see yourself or see oneself as designers of learning, we have to move beyond the lesson. And I'm sure most people do, but in terms of our planning, it has to design the kind of tasks and activities that are sequential, and so that we know if we are wanting to develop textual fluency, if we are wanting our learners to understand the epistemic value, and that just simply means knowing what specific kind of knowledge relates to different kinds of areas, is fundamental to teaching and learning. But particularly, I would emphasize textual fluency in our current world is absolutely essential, so that learners develop ideas of criticality, of really analyzing any kind of text into who's said it and why, and what's their view, what is their perspective, how can we bring all this together, how can we understand that we have different values and different cultures may have different values, and so on and so forth. So I think, in a very roundabout, quick way, what I've tried to do here is to emphasize conceptual models that actually need to be owned and context specific. And secondly, in this section, to really say that as designers, it means that we are moving beyond existing resources and we're actually looking out there to developing textual fluency, which might relate directly to the subject discipline, or in a language it could relate to phenomena, topics, and so on. So it's all about ownership, and teachers can do that, especially if we can make sure that networks are active and share our designs. Very difficult. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Dole. This is beautifully said. It really highlights the intention behind every decision in a CLIL classroom, especially what do we want our students to know, or where do we want to take our students, and then also looking at the nature of the different tasks and the different types of text that we give the students, so we can encourage critical thinking, connection, and deep learning. We're going to turn towards CLIL in a language class, so for language learning. And we're going to go and speak with Fred. Fred, could you tell us what are some key implications of CLIL on students' language acquisition and development?
D'abord, je m'excuse auprès des francophones, mais on m'a dit que je devais répondre en anglais, donc ça va se faire en anglais. So, we are on to English there. Well, I would say for me, the key objective of CLIL would be to lead to some accelerated learning through increased motivation. Why? Because the content and the cognitive level of the learners are not lowered because of their language level. And that's quite a key change. But it works providing that the language element is not lip service or merely a list of bilingual glossaries. And in some CLIL classes, unfortunately, that's what happened. The language teacher will provide the subject teacher with a list of translated words and expressions and think, hey, we're doing CLIL. And we all express ourselves in our own subjects. We've got our own subject language. Language is really the key thing, and you really have, whatever it is that you teach, you have to have in your mind language. And when I say language, it's not French, German, or whatever. It's what kind of structures, what kind of vocabulary, even myself, maybe I've got some mimics with my language. What is it that I use in my lesson? That's why the CLIL model is quite interesting, because Do mentioned the triptych. The triptych refers to the language of, language for, and language through. Now, the language of will be, well, typically the subject specialist vocabulary. So that's where indeed your glossaries come in handy, and anything related to the content. But more important, in my view, is also the language for, because how do you train? Doe said, how do I know that my students know? How do they know that they know? And how do you train them in your own area to describe, to explain, to argue, to analyze, to synthesize, and so on, all these key factors. And for that, you need to have a specific vocabulary, and that language is going to vary because you don't describe the same way in science as you do in a literature class, for example. I'm moving on to pluriliteracy a bit, but that is important with the language for, and how you operate in a classroom. How, when you do a role play or you ask your students to have a discussion, what kind of language does that entail? So it's important to give them these tools as well. And finally, the language through is my favorite because it's the one that was not planned for. And that's usually the result of discussions between students or between you and your students. And like a classic example, we're talking about 19th century literature, and I'd written on the board 19 in Roman numbers, and the kids didn't know the Roman numbers. So we had a crash lesson on Roman numbers, and that led to a discussion on math and multiplications. And then a Japanese student started to talk about how they do multiplications in Japan. And that's what makes the education, the learning so brilliant, so fascinating. And it's not to be scared to stop sometimes what you're doing. I think I've got something else that was not planned, but this is learning. This is part of what makes my job so wonderful. So that's it. So that's the language through. I'm done, Dunja, on that
All
one,
right.
unless you want to know something else.
Well, thank you, Fred. Yes, I think that Fred put a finger on something quite important. It's the language, the language triptych, which has the language of, the language for, and the language through. And especially the language for is very important because it is the language that you give the students so they can express their understanding. So it's also the language that you use when you give activities. So if you want your students to have a debate, you're going to need to give them the vocabulary, the expressions, and just all the language they need in order to have a debate. And research shows that most teachers actually do not take the time to make that language explicit. So that is a very good tip, Fred, that you have given us to remember when we plan our lessons, and especially when we plan our activities. I do have a second question for you. The second question I have for you is, how would you explain the difference between a regular lesson and a CLIL lesson, both in design and delivery?
Okay, well, I'm going to focus more on my subject, which is language. So French as an L1, which is native speakers level, or French as L2, which is as a foreign language. When I was working with Doe and researching a little bit on CLIL, I realized that a lot of the research was focused on what was happening in the subject lessons taught in L2. But very little was said of an actual language lesson, and in particular L2. So that was a big question mark for me, because my reasoning was, if the content is not to be lowered in the subject because of the language level of the students, say beginners, what are the implications for the language class itself? Does that mean we could give potentially native speakers level content to a class of even beginners? I mean, that seems like heresy and impossible. And yet, after a few years of research and practice, the answer is yes, within reason. Obviously, we can't perform miracles, but it does work through careful planning and a lot of scaffolding. I'm just going to give you a very simple example. Whether you teach Spanish, German, French, or Italian, whatever, as a foreign language. For example, when you talk about people and descriptions. In a typical beginner's class, you're going to be talking about physical descriptions, color of your hair, eyes, and then you'll be moving on to personalities, and that's about it. Now imagine if you're a 12, 13-year-old kind of starting a language and you're being asked to describe yourself. So here's my picture, and talk a little bit about your personality. That's fine. We start to include star signs and so on, Chinese numbers. It makes it a bit more interesting. You could talk about the portrait in Proust to make it slightly more. You talk about portrait chinois. That gives a different perspective of what is a description. That's a cultural element. But then what's stopping you from adding, I don't know, habits, emotions, fears, nervous tics, phobies. Why don't we start teaching about metaphors and simile when dealing with the description? And I have a Google slide where I show how, from a typical L2 class at level A1, you can move step by step your students to a level B2 just on describing people, and you can move to 19th century literature, portraits and descriptions with a class of beginners. And frankly, that content is hell of a lot more stimulating and motivating than just asking a student to describe themselves.
That's right. And I think something that is very interesting is that for many, many years, teachers or people who thought about CLIL always thought about content and language integrated learning. So this means we teach our content using a different language. However, we've been working with Fred. What we see is that we can also bring the content from a discipline into our language class to make, first of all, the topics more interesting, but especially, like Fred just said, we can go much more in depth than just having a regular description of a character, and help students to gain language that they can use outside of the classroom and help them with their communication. So thank you, Fred.
If I may add, Dunja,
Yes.
in a language class, typically it's kind of ordered by a grammatical structure.
Exactly.
Where somehow someone decided that it was easier to start with avoir un être and then the present tense, and then eventually adjectives, and then eventually you're going to get that magic past tense and future tense and so on. And eventually, when you're an advanced neonative, you do a subjunctive. And my rationale is why? Why do you teach a language based on the grammatical spine, which bears no relevance to a child's cognitive ability and makes the content so limited? So for me, the grammar should not be your obstacle. And if it means with a class of beginners at some stage, you're going to be covering a little bit of the subjunctive because it helps to serve your content, then why not? Okay,
Yes,
so we can
definitely.
go back onto this, but I think it's important to bear that in mind. And
I think
all the language books, Spanish, French, and are all the same. They follow that grammatical pattern, which in my view is a killer of languages and language learning.
Yes, definitely. And it is important to be aware that the language progression we find in the textbooks is different from the language progression we actually use when we learn a language. And we see that very clearly when we teach a subject in another language, for example, science. We've experienced it in our school. Our students did a scientific experiment, and then we asked them to talk about the experiment, and they needed the past tense immediately, the first 2-3 weeks of school. And when we look in the progression of language learning in a textbook, we see that the past tense only comes in the second year. So this really is a hindrance rather than a tool to be able to improve. So thank you very much, Fred. The two very important points. And now let's have a look at CLIL in the discipline class. So we're going to talk with Susanne. Welcome, Susanne. I have two questions for you also. The first one is, could you share some practical examples of scaffolding language in a CLIL classroom?
Yes, I can actually easily relate to what Fred said earlier about grammar is, yes, using it when you need it. And for example, yeah, you would always want to scaffold language and cognition together. And for example, I did a unit on the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the students were supposed to talk about contingency, like what would have happened if Kennedy had attacked the Soviet missile sites. And you can easily see that what you need is conditional too. Yeah, because if you want to talk about contingency, which is a historical concept, you do need this language structure which reflects that kind of thinking. And in this way, I would always do scaffolding that serves both the language and the content. And yeah, what you can do with this grammar structure, you need it in this moment. You can do foreign language teaching in the content classroom by, for example, giving them as a starter. For example, if Kennedy had attacked the Soviet missile sites, and now go on, okay? Or if you've got weaker students, like language-wise weaker students, you might also do a matching activity here. Like give them various scenarios, various if clauses, and make them match them with the would if plus have plus past participle. And you can use the language structure to scaffold the disciplinary thinking here. What I always also do quite like, and I think I think I best show you an example is that I use something I call language frames, which is a cognitive and language scaffolding that serves to actually communicate appropriately disciplinary content. For example, this is something I did not do myself. This is something a student of mine did, teacher trainee did. And you can easily see that there's, this is like on the back, there's the structure of a historical analysis of letters from the front, from the First World War. And she gives them like the methodology really, explains the genre moves. And here you can find the letter, okay? And then she gives them structured help, but added by language help. Okay, you can see that. So this is the language help for this, and you turn it around, it's language help for this. Okay, and that should enable them to actually write a very, very professional historical analysis of a letter from the front. And then I was really, really amazed by this already. She did a second lesson, turning this into production. And you can see now this is where they can write a letter from the front, fictional one, of course. And what the students get is this. They get a map of First World War front lines. They get a timeline here. And they also get language help. For example, what could they talk about? Like daily life, hopes and fears, verbs, adjectives like worried, desperate, brave, dutiful, and so on. And that enables them to write this letter from the front. So you can see this is not only a language scaffolding, but it's also a scaffolding for disciplinary communication and, at the end of the day, of course, for disciplinary thinking. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. It really shows how important it is that you always think of the content and you think of the language. And with the content, like she just showed with her, that Susanne just showed with the example, is you need to also teach them, let's say if you're going to describe or you're going to write a letter, how do you do this? I mean, what's the process? What's the method of writing a letter? How do you start? How do you continue? How do you connect everything? And that's the scaffolding for your content. But then you need to also make sure you scaffold your language. So by giving language frames or giving language starters, or like you said, maybe matching exercises or filling the blanks. But yes, you do need to, it's very important to look at the two types of scaffolding to be able to give the tools to your students so they can be successful in the activity. So thank you so much, Susanne. I have a last question for you. How do you implement CLIL in your subject area, whether it's humanities, science, or language arts?
Yes, I'm a history and politics teacher, so I can talk about that for ages, but I'm trying to start with the sciences classroom. First of all, I would always look at the kind of communication that the discipline demands, or that is typical for the discipline. Now, for sciences, you would have genres that reflect this scientific road to knowledge construction, like, for example, a lab report or something like that. For arts, you would have something, yeah, I guess, analytical and also evaluative genres that are based on criteria, orientation, something like, you describe and judge a piece of art, for example. For humanities, of course, you have these analytical and evaluative genres, such as I just showed to you, but also very argumentative, like discussions in politics. And of course, if I planning a CLIL lesson, or not only, I think lesson, as Kdo said, is not enough. A lesson is not enough. You'd have to go further than that. You would actually plan a task, a learning task that has some kind of product or outcome in the end. And I would ask myself, like, what do I want them to learn? And what kind of a product or outcome would best reflect this learning process? And I immediately come back to the genres, to the disciplinary genres, and then do backward planning. Is, for example, I want them to be able to talk about a work of art. Okay, in what real life setting does this communication make sense? And it does make sense, for example, if you have to create a museum guide. Okay, so let's make museum guides for the specific period of time, like Impressionism. Okay, so for a scientist, I would say, okay, make a keynote for a scientific congress. Okay, for a politics lesson, you could do a podcast or a newspaper comment. Whatever. And I do think the more I teach it, the more I think it has to be relevant, authentic communication in the outside world, and not something you write for your teacher. That is really, really essential also for this engagement we want to create. And once you have that, you can plan the lessons according to the needs of your learners. Like, what do they need in order to be able to produce this kind of communication? And you end up by really anticipating how, what kind of language they need, what kind of structure they need, what kind of input they need, what kind of a social setting they need for their learning to co-construct knowledge. And voila, there's your learning task. And your scaffolding. And you should also think about opportunities to give feedback, feed up, feed forward. And then you might end up with with students who experience some kind of personal growth, who experience self-efficacy. And yes, I'm very, very convinced that by giving them those patterns of disciplinary communication, you can really bring about deeper learning and deeper understanding, of structures, which is transferable into other languages, into other subjects. And this is something we do need for like 21st century education. We cannot and we do not have to learn everything by heart anymore. We have to learn the essential bits. And by learning the essentials of disciplinary communication, you can get quite far.
Yes.
Oh.
Thank you so much. This is another very important aspect of CLIL. It's really to be aware of the language characteristics of each discipline, and to especially, like Susanne just said so well, to look at the disciplinary genre. What does it look like when you have to create a piece in science, like a lab report? What does it look like when you have to judge a piece of art, or when you have to argue a point in humanities? And these are all skills that often we don't take the time to explain, and we don't show the differences between them. And then once we know what the type of genre that we want to give, we need to especially give the language so the students can do that and can perform it and be successful. Yeah, thank you so much. That's a very important part of CLIL, and actually we're going into pluriliteracies here. Yes. Excellent. Well, these are the questions we had with our experts. Before we move to the questions and answers, sorry, I'd like to just let you know about an exciting opportunity. At InTA, we have now created a discussion group for CLIL. And so it's a place where you can come and you can connect with other CLIL teachers. You can ask questions, or you can share material, maybe a lesson that worked well, or maybe even a lesson that did not work well, and ask for advice. And it's also a place where you can support each other. So if you're interested in joining, now that you're all part of the InTA platform, all you need to do is to go on the main menu. And on the main menu or the home page, you select community, and then you find the CLIL discussion group and you click join group. And once you're in, feel free to introduce yourself, and then you can start engaging with others. This will be very, I think it will be very practical, maybe not during the summer, because I'm hoping that you will take a break. But when you come back in September, you know, if you have to teach something, you're not sure how to do it exactly, you can ask questions and ask for support from other people, and especially from other people around Europe. And we do have Canadians, so actually even outside of Europe. Now let's move to the question and answer section. Maybe what we can do is either you can raise your hand on the computer, or you can post a question in the chat. What will happen is, once I see that you have a question, I will have to unmute you from here, and then you will have to accept the unmute, and then you'll be able to speak to the rest of the group. Let's see, do I see anything? Yes, yes, Susanne, I'll be able to publish, to bring an example, to put an example on the platform.
Yes. Yeah, I made a mistake there. So
that's okay, no problem at all. I don't know if we see any questions. Anybody has a question, you can ask directly to the expert, one of the experts, anything specific? I don't see everybody on my screen, so I'm not sure. Oh, here we have one. Alors, let me have a look. I'm going to give you so you should be able to, Gemad, now to be able to
Hi, hello.
Yeah.
Hi. I'd like to know a little bit about PTDL, because I've heard about this lately, but I don't know exactly what it is. So maybe you can. It's related to CLIL. It's Pluriliteracies Teaching for Deeper Learning. So if you can give us a clue of what's this, I would appreciate it.
Yes, should we, who would like to answer? Do, Susanne, Fred?
I think that's for Do.
All right. Do, you need to unmute.
Oh, sorry. You think by now I'd get used to this. So PTDL is related to the era that I was talking about, which is really focusing on literacies. And it's a holistic concept. It's teaching for deeper learning. And deeper learning is the kind of learning which we really internalize in such a way it's not about memory and simply being able to regurgitate, but it's about the internal depth of the learning, which then we're able to use in different contexts and so on. So the pluriliteracies relates to what does that look like in the classroom if we consider the way that we communicate, what we're learning and how we know it, and the different genres, the different types of language that Fred and Susanne have been talking about. How do we relate that with the actual knowledge base? So it's not only the depth of the knowledge, but also the language that we use to express that. So that's fairly straightforward. But as part of the model, there is also the role of the teacher, and the role of the teacher is mentoring learning, which means that you make explicit learning. We talk to learners about their learning, the processes that are involved, and so on and so forth. And then for the learners themselves, we're trying to develop a sense of growth mindset, resilience to challenge, to motivation, and so on. So all of that brings this together. But at the heart of it all, there's subject disciplinary literacies, because as said, there's differences between subjects. And can I please emphasize that as part of that, languages is also a discipline. So French as a language or German as a language, it's a discipline. And within those disciplines, there are ways of behaving, of understanding, of being enculturized and so on. All of those are brought into one model. So it is quite complex on one hand, but on the other, I think it was Oliver Mayer's idea to divide it into mechanics and drivers. And the mechanics are all to do with the learning process, the way we communicate our learning, the way we language our learning, so that the teacher can tell instantly whether there's a problem, whether if a student is struggling to explain. So we're asking students to explain their learning, and you can tell instantly whether there might be a problem, and that problem lies in not having the language means to express, or not really understanding, or both. And so as a teacher, that's a real gift in being able to then judge where different learners are, or where the whole class is in terms of understanding and language in their learning. So that's the mechanics and the drivers of the people within it who make it all work. So mechanics are the learning elements of it, and drivers are the role of the teacher in that scaffolding, the feedback, the way we are, because basically to me, who we are and where we are, what we do in a classroom. So I don't know whether that explains the model, but if you access the book, either the companion or a previous, in 2021, Beyond CLIL was published, and that goes through it page by page by page by page. It's a complex read in places, but in others, it's to me, it's quite inspiring in how it's drawing together all literacies. It's a very long-winded way of saying it's quite complex, but actually learning's complex. So it's and I think really, really helpful. And teachers, I say that with confidence because I'm working with all the maths teachers, and they're loving it. It's giving them renewed kind of motivation to do things a bit different.
Excellent, thank you. I see. They're asking, can you please give us the title of the book?
Yeah, I can.
So I can show you the last one.
No, it's the one before that. It's this one.
All right, so I have the last one here, and then Bill will show you the one before. Oh, it's called Beyond CLIL. We can't see it because you have a blurry background.
Sorry, I can't do anything about that. I'll put it in the text.
Yeah, maybe you can put it into the chat. Are there any other questions for our three experts? I'm looking at the chat. Okay, I have a question from Janice. So here it is. I teach primary school. My students are 8 and 9 years old. I worry changing the subject from content to language will confuse them. Susanne or Fred, would you be able to answer this question?
I think this is to change from content to language. I'm not quite sure if I understand that question, because I mean, language is all around, isn't it? It's no matter if you teach in your L1 or in L2, it's always there. And when I was teaching at the German school London, I had half of my group was more proficient in German and the other half was more proficient in English. And it didn't matter. They all needed academic language to talk about those subjects. Now, for primary school, it probably sounds a bit weird to talk about academic language, but you can actually prepare them at that age to, first of all, possibly in their L1, that there are certain ways of expressing, for example, cause and effect. So you might start there with the language functions and say, how do you say that? You say that, well, blah, 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 because, or as, this happens. So you can start there, and you can even start in your L1 and then make them think about language and how it is used to think. And you can do that from a very early age without confusion. On the contrary, I think my experience is that the students having those language scaffolding in whatever language, they start to be more precise in their disciplinary thinking. And they really regard this as helpful because they experience themselves as empowered to speak in a way that sounds appropriate and grown up. And I think even 8 to 9-year-olds, of course, all in relation to their content, they are happy to be able to communicate appropriately. And you can guide this by appropriate scaffolding in whatever language. I don't know if this was helpful.
I was about to say as well, you don't need a complete overhaul straight away. I co-teach French in a science class for 9 and 10-year-olds, and it's, you put things into place, and there are parts of the unit that are taught in English in the L1 language of instruction, and other parts are taught in French, but very quickly once they're used to this, at least a bilingual, if not an immersion at the beginning, they're used to using more and more the L2. It becomes a reflex. It's not threatening, and it can be fun. Very often with Dunja, we all often say when you have a discussion with your students, is it a language function discussion or is it a cognitive discussion? And nothing is wrong about reverting to L1, to the language of instruction. This idea that suddenly everything is done in the second language straight away might be a bit ambitious, depends again on the context of your school. There are some schools where it's just not going to be possible, but work on one unit and see how it goes. And then if that works, then develop that more and more into your curriculum. But that doesn't mean you're changing the subject to the language. As Susanne said, it's the whole. They're intertwined. They can't be dissociated.
And maybe just to rebound on this, when you have your students speak about cognitive task in their L1, so they can really talk about it and understand it and get into deep learning and into deep understanding. And then you ask them to report it to the class or to tell you what conclusions they came to in the L2. And there you give them some language scaffolding to do so. But the thinking, the digging, and all this, because it's cognitive, depending on the level of the students, if they're an A1 or A2 or B1, they can't do that in their language too. I see there's a question about Miriam, from Miriam, pardon. Do we need to include all the 4 C's of CLIL in every class activity? Could someone just talk a little bit about that? I see there was an answer that says no, but maybe we can expand a little bit on it.
Also answered that I'm working with it's about the moment, and I'm working with a teacher at the moment who, if he feels that the students need a little bit of, say, grammar help, just pure language help, he calls it commercial breaks, like you get on the TV. And he says, right, okay, we're going to have a commercial break. And he'll teach the grammar point, practice it a little bit in the most traditional way, it doesn't matter. And the students then do those kind of tasks, and then, right, it's the end of the commercial break, and they're back into that, whatever they've been discussing, and they're applying it. So there's all these little strategies. And I guess one other thing that is helpful to say in all of this is that in a pluriliteracies model, there are ways of operating or operationalizing the learning, and that includes sort of doing tasks, DOEA, organizing tasks, explaining tasks, and arguing tasks. And many teachers try and equate that with something like the Bloom's taxonomy, and more recently the language functions. But what that means is that there's design all the time in terms of enabling us to think, if we want our students to argue, what does that mean? And what kind, and that cuts across all age ranges. But argumentation, I think, is crucial, because it's not about who's going to win this argument, but rather how we dig deeper into understanding other people's positions and so on. But the learners need the language to do that. So I think it's about relating where we want to go with all this, and really analysing the kind of language that the learners need, and then just creating possibilities to use it in the classroom. Make mistake. So.
I think we have one more question. I will take the last question, so then we will close the panel discussion. This is from Miriam. How can you apply CLIL in a school where teachers are experts in a subject such as biology or geography, but they do not master the vehicular language? Should teachers have at least a C1 to apply CLIL? Oh, that's a very good question. Who would like to answer?
I think I can say something about the Berlin context here. We've got a CLIL teacher training, and the requirement to get the certificate is actually C2 for the sort of extended CLIL programs, and it's C1 for the module 1. Which is, and what we do is, well, in Germany we're fortunate to have like a two subject teachers. So it's usually foreign language teachers who also have a subject, such as biology, geography, and history. But we also have people who have been studying, for example, in the United States or in the UK, and because they have studied in English or they've studied in France. We assume that they can sort of have a disciplinary discourse in these languages, in French or English. We do not offer that for Spanish, not for Italian. But this is how we help ourselves. We take people who have studied abroad and assume, and of course they have to show a lesson, and then they get the certificate. So there's a bit of a test to that. But I think it's very difficult if you do not know the language, because it's disciplinary discourse in a foreign language. It's not like being on a holiday and ordering beer.
I think it also depends on what is the age of your students. Because I worked in a school here in Switzerland where all the teachers were told that they had to now teach in German, and some of them did not speak German, but they had students of 6, 7, 8 years old. And for example, one teacher taught art and did not speak German, so he just learned. Well, he spoke a little bit. He was maybe an A2 level, and then he just learned the vocabulary and then demonstrated. So with the little ones, it's a little bit easier, but once you get, like Susanne says, to a secondary level, then it's just too complicated, because you have to understand the language characteristics of the discipline.
But you might be able to form tandems. That's, I think, what happens in Fred school.
Yeah, that's why I said we did co-teaching. Gradually, teachers who've been in the co-teaching situation for several years are getting the confidence now to do more and more on their own. So it's kind of coaching, guiding, being there, delivering. So I was delivering the science lesson in French, preparing the resources with the teacher. And then after 2, 3 years, teacher felt confident enough to do the bits in French as well, even though it's not at all their language. So it depends how you construct all that between the language and the subject teacher. I mean, obviously, from the school point of view, it requires timetabling and resources and money. Not every school can do this, but if you have got a specialist teacher and a language teacher who are willing to work together, why not making that space on the timetable if the administrator agrees?
Yes. Well, thank you so much for everyone for joining this discussion, and thank you so much for our 3 panelists and experts in CLIL. This was a wonderful conversation, and we were able to answer some of the questions. If you still have some other questions, I suggest you join that CLIL discussion group on the platform, and then the discussion can continue. You can either ask questions or give some examples of how it's working in your class, or just even connect with other people who teach CLIL, so you don't feel so lonely in your school, because often there's only 1 or 2 teachers in a school. So then you can exchange and help each other. So thank you again for coming and for taking the time to be with us. It's lovely to see that we've had lots of people that we've met in person when we did our ECML workshops. Let's keep in touch, and all the best. And first, have a wonderful summer holiday and rest fully for your next school year. Bye-bye. Thanks.